Good evening, this is Mae Brussell. The title of this one-hour broadcast is World Watchers. It's program number 797, March the 17th, 1987. The co-owner of the Monterey Herald, our only newspaper here in the Monterey, Carmel, Pacific Grove area, Paul Block, died yesterday at Community Hospital. He was co-publisher of The Blade, the Toledo newspaper in Ohio, and the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, along with his brother. They were in the publishing business. He also was a scientist, a chemist, who got a degree in chemistry from Columbia University and advanced studies at Yale, and had a very interesting background that most of us are deprived of knowing until somebody passes away. We learn about the things that they did and their interests and their accomplishments in the obituary, unfortunately, and people like this who are very private people don't reveal much of themselves and lead a very quiet life. He spent time between here and Ohio and lived at Pebble Beach. Several years ago, quite a few years ago, Mr. Block's secretary called me and said that he and his wife would like me to come over to the house. They were having a cocktail party or a gathering of some kind. And I said that I was not interested in attending. I appreciate the invitation, but I don't go to parties where there's more than 10 people, and I know this would be that kind of a gathering, and I'm really not interested. And so they called me back and said they were interested in having me over, that I was important in the community, and that he would like to meet me. And they were just having this small gathering. So I went to his home and enjoyed myself and spent time there and then came home. About 2 years later, the San Francisco Chronicle had an article by Jack Anderson on Project Paperclip, and the Monterey Herald carries the same Jack Anderson column during the weekdays that the San Francisco one does, but it's a bit longer. The San Francisco edits out some important information. They select which paragraphs they keep out. The Chronicle has a long Jack Anderson during the weekdays, and I called the Monterey Herald and said that I would like them to print the column that San Francisco had on Project Paperclip, because the few years before I had given 2 semesters of college credit classes on political assassinations, and Project Paperclip was number 1 on the list of books to read if you want to understand political assassinations and coup d'etat and what is happening to this country. And Project Paperclip is timely today, of course. So the manager of the Herald, the local area here, said that he wouldn't print it, that they had scheduled for other days, whatever came in those days, and that this was over and it wouldn't be printed. So I picked up the telephone and called Mr. Block in Ohio, in Toledo, Ohio, and he was very, very understanding. And as I look at the bio of his background, I understand more why he was so cooperative. And he said, well, I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll put a direct line into Jack Anderson. He sends in 7 articles a week, and we choose which ones out of the 5 days, but I'll have it in Saturday and Sunday, and you'll get 7 days continuously, which is more probably than any other newspaper in the United States. And he did it quickly. He said, you'll have your Project Paperclip article on Tuesday, and from then on you'll have 7 days to choose or to study whatever it is you want to see. Now, about 3 months ago, they took the Saturday Jack Anderson out, and I was wondering if they were going to do the Sunday again, and I would call Ohio. They changed the Saturday format. But this was a person who moved very quickly, who was intelligent about what I was trying to say and why I thought it mattered. And then reading about his life, one of the things that they called attention to in the Monterey Herald today was his interest in defending Dr. Robert Oppenheimer. At the time, he was accused of having some friends who might have been in the Communist Party, that he was a staunch editorial defender of Oppenheimer, that he wrote papers on the fetish of atomic secrecy, that we should share information, and he was concerned with a great deal of things out there besides just running newspapers or just his scientific expertise, which he was supposed to hold certain, he was the sole source of certain synthetic analogs for thyroid hormones that he had developed and synthesized that helped respiratory distress and so forth. He was very active in medicine with medical groups, societies, and in scientific work, but he showed enough interest in my particular project to be as cooperative as he could, and I appreciated that always. And sometimes people ask me, particularly on the talk show part of my program, who do you like? Who are your heroes? And last week I was sharing with them some of the people that I've admired through the years. But there are a lot of people whose lives have crossed, or mine, or I've crossed through theirs, in some way or contact that made a difference in my state of mind, that doors aren't closed, you aren't rejected, that people out there can help you, even people from Fortune 500, such as the Blocks, can help you. And so I feel that I'm fortunate to meet some of these people, and then in turn they do something very useful in terms of just like printing those materials, which I share with you many times on the article, on the program, Jack Anderson stories that you wouldn't get from any other newspaper. So I just wanted to pass this little bit on to you. About Project Paperclip, I haven't mentioned the TV movie that was on about a month ago. I don't know how many of you get public broadcasting or saw the movie. It was a very interesting 1-hour documentary on Project Paperclip. There was one a few years ago. This was even more interesting. And the interesting thing about this, there were 3 points that I noticed in this presentation at this time. One was that when the V-2 rockets were built that were bombing Great Britain, Walter Dornberger used Wernher von Braun, who was only 22 years old at the time, and they were all high risks to come to the United States. The book Project Paperclip explains that. The loyalty was questioned whether they would have their allegiance to Adolf Hitler and the Third Reich, but they were brought here anyway. The second point that was interesting in this movie was that Heinrich Himmler was the man who separated the space weapons from the general weapons system in Nazi Germany. And when the Project Paperclip scientists came here, the atomic scientists and NASA separated themselves from the regular Defense Department or the Air Force or Navy. They were their own agency. NASA, with headquarters in Muscle Shoals, Alabama, and Huntsville, Alabama. That area came into prominence at the time the Challenger was ordered to go up and then went down within 4 minutes. And they became their own private agency. And Heinrich Himmler was the gentleman working through SS Karl Wolff with Allen Dulles of the OSS, making arrangements for after the war to transfer the paperclip scientists to the United States. Their war horrors and their mass labor, slave labor, and murders associated with the death camps where they worked them to death at Dora and Peenemünde. The separation of these people from the regular military gave them their own elite clique and kept them working by themselves. And Himmler, whose idea was to separate it, was very close to the Americans who were to bring these people over to the United States. And then finally, one of the most important parts of this movie, it explains how President Truman said, don't bring war criminals into the United States. But it didn't matter what the president said. The powers that be, such as William Donovan or William Allen Dulles of the OSS, and William Casey was in the OSS, but Donovan and Dulles had the primary say in those days. They could bring these Nazi criminals, knowing they were here, knowing they were criminals, into the United States. And as soon as Reinhard Gehlen, the chief of Hitler's intelligence of the East, left the United States and went back to Germany after he formed our CIA, he went back to Germany and was head of the BND, the German intelligence. And then he proceeded to go through all the war records and erase the files and all sources of information about the paperclip persons who were here, all their criminal war behavior, and their names were erased. So I wonder, when I see the picture of the docket with Fritz Kramer, number 33 in the docket, with Sepp Dietrich and Hermann Priest and his gang of cohorts from the Malmedy Massacre, when Kramer's name appears in no history books after World War II in any way, shape, or form, he had to be erased along with the Gehlen operation of erasing the names of people who were criminals, because Adolf Hitler's criminal, the Fritz Kramer, has never been seen or identified, but later, within a short time period, 1948, he's working with the same people in our Defense Department and in the Pentagon, with the State Department also, that are working with the other Nazis. And it's hard to believe that the Fritz Kramer that starts working for the federal government in 1948 is different than the Fritz Kramer who was released by Senator Joe McCarthy in 1948 out of the Dachau prison. In reading the Webster's military biography of Albert Wiedemeyer, and I've shared this with you before, he's the general that Ronald Reagan gave a Medal of Freedom not too long ago. Wiedemeyer trained at West Point, went to Texas for some more work, went to China, the Philippines, spent 2 years in the Philippines, worked with the General Staff School at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. Then he was attached to the Intelligence Division of the General Staff and attended the Kriegsakademie of Adolf Hitler, the military school in Berlin, from 1938 to 1940. He was the first American since World War I to attend the German military school. He joined Eisenhower. He was an aide to General Marshall. He was the chief of staff to Chiang Kai-shek. He was the leader of the Kuomintang at the time. And Chiang formed the World Anti-Communist League, and out of that milieu they created Reverend Moon with Ryoshi Sasakawa's help, and were influential in Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan. So the history of Wiedemeyer goes from his early days in the military to Germany, then in Asia, and with these organizations that are headed, like World Anti-Communist League, by John Singlaub. The Contragate story and the Iran Gate story ties directly to the activities and locations of people like Wiedemeyer, who are honored by the President of the United States and who attended the Kriegsakademie. Now, in the book The Crossroads of Death, the story of the Malmedy Massacre, is written by James Weingartner. He says that Fritz Kramer, the man who served time in the docket for the Malmedy Massacre, has a background which is described in quotes as not available. Information on his early years are not available, but he has served in the Berlin Municipal Police at the time that Wiedemeyer could have been in Germany, 1930. He went to Germany and was at the Kriegsakademie from 38 to 40. Kramer was in Berlin, and he attended the Kriegsakademie 1934 to 35. So that just 3 years before Wiedemeyer joins the Kriegsakademie of Adolf Hitler, Fritz Kramer was there for 3 years, and his purpose there from 1934 to 35 was to teach the Germans how to circumvent the Versailles Treaty, to secretly arm Germany. And this similarity between the Fritz Kramer on the National Security Council now and the Fritz Kramer that was in Germany, I think maybe you can see the resemblance, because our National Security Council has given orders to people like General Secord, who left the Air Force and then joined the Defense Intelligence Agency as an unsalaried consultant. He was to bypass the State Department, bypass the CIA, bypass the Pentagon and the existing Congress, and to go ahead and arm Iran or arm the Contras, both of them illegal. There were congressional orders and bills passed that they were not to arm the Contras or to send weapons to Khomeini. But the Fritz Kramer that was in Germany was teaching how to circumvent the Versailles Treaty, and the Fritz Kramer that sits on the National Security Council was working with the powers that be to circumvent the existing institutions, again, these parallel governments. Now, James Weingartner refers to Kramer as a military intellectual of the type that characterized the Prussian General Staff Corps. And when war began, he was part of the 13th Panzer Division and was awarded the Knight's Cross, the senior quartermaster, to 1st Panzer Corps. He got a lot of medals, and he switched to the Leibstandarte and the 13th Panzer, then the SS Panzer with Sepp Dietrich, and the Waffen-SS borrowed Kramer, and he became a member of the Waffen-SS. He was, in fact, a member of the Waffen-SS and was part of the 1st Panzer Division, but always the person who is the intellectual. He may not have actually been in any of these battles at all, and he was appointed Chief of Staff of the 6th Panzer Division at the Ardennes Offensive. But the point is that his expertise was not in fighting. There's no record of him in any battle at all or any location of a battle, but his expertise was how to get around the existing laws and training the private companies and the Freikorps, who looked independent but were part of the military, the death squads that were operating and knocking out the liberals or the radicals or the resistance, and then having a grand election in 1933, and then Murder Incorporated became legal. We have those parallels now, and the point is that both of these men, Wiedemeyer and Kramer, attended this Berlin War Academy, the Kriegsakademie, and weren't many years apart. Weingarten describes Kramer as an entirely different category than the other Germans because information on his past isn't available, as I say, and he was a member of the Waffen SS. Now, Weingarten says he was there not of his own volition. How would he know he's not of his own volition? This Kramer left, the American Kramer that was the mentor to Henry Kissinger, left his wife and child in Nazi Germany by his own choice during the war. I will do more on the Weingarten book and his interpretation of Kramer later, but the importance of Project Paperclip I emphasized just not too many weeks ago. A quotation that was in Nation magazine, August 1986, where Walter Dornberger, that same person that came over on Project Paperclip, said that he didn't come to this country to lose the Third World War. I lost two, and I don't want to lose the third. So that the activity or interest in the paperclip scientists that could lead us to the Third World War is very important, and it's interesting that a retired military in charge of the desk of the news department at the Monterey Herald left out the Project Paperclip. You wonder how many people really know about these things and don't give any indication of why they selectively take that material and not want the people to read it. The problem with escalating war is, as we get into another one and they plan the fourth one, is that a lot of people know that these plans are in the offing, but they don't want those people who suffer the most or pay for the war to know. They're actually the last to know. The Trilateral Commission is having their meeting in San Francisco. Those of you who get these broadcasts, it will be over. It'll only be over in terms of the physical meeting. The pressure of the meeting will be over us for a long, long time. They're meeting in San Francisco this week. Henry Kissinger is the main speaker. He's traveling with David Rockefeller and National Security Advisor Frank Carlucci. Those will be among the main speakers. And Kissinger will give a half-hour talk called After Reykjavik, which is really shocking. And After Reykjavik will be given in private. And if past practice is followed, the text might be available for the press. I hope it will be. It's interesting that I fingered Fritz Kramer and Henry Kissinger as top in the United States, a hierarchy of this manipulation that's going on. And I also have identified Reykjavik as the beginning and the end of the Ronald Reagan presidency. That when Nicholas Danilov was arrested in Russia, I believe this was a setup. And after that event, when the Russians were forced to release them, the conditions were, we'll meet at Reykjavik. Ronald Reagan wasn't prepared to meet there. And the disaster of that began to show how the president was toppling and not in control of matters. There's an article in the L.A. Herald, March the 6th, a syndicated column by William Sapphire on a polygraph test given to Robert McFarlane, and he allegedly failed the test, and it was printed by Philip Taubman of the New York Times, and it was an exclusive story saying U.S. aides say British spy gave Soviet key data. And this is a article citing American sources that Philip Taubman wrote about, and about the British government and a serious leak that went on to the Russians. And allegedly there was a lie detector test given, and Robert McFarlane was the person who was supposed to have given the leak, and he didn't pass the test. And then the pressure was put on the powers that be to get the New York Times to say who did the leaking to the newspaper, because McFarlane was certified as a non-leaker. He was staying in the White House staff. He was promoted a year later to National Security Advisor, and the polygraph testers just explained that they almost had to terminate their career, and they couldn't get reliable resource by questioning about leaks from other officials. Later, it was admitted that by Mr. Taubman that it wasn't McFarlane that gave the leak. But the important part about shuffling up the National Security Council, giving polygraph tests to join Pondexter or to their secretaries and so forth, is that Philip Taubman was the gentleman behind that. He printed it October 24th, 1982. And Philip Taubman was the gentleman who was working with Mrs. Danilov, and who she was in contact with when Danilov gave a package with some messages to a fellow, and Danilov was picked up and arrested. and the American embassy wasn't informed, and the Soviet Union had called Mrs. Danilov, but the arrangements as an agent provocateur situation that brought Ronald Reagan out in the open as being less than in control of himself and exposed to secret dealings really began with the Taubman-Danilov relationship. And you'd have to go back to my other Danilov tapes. I did 2 hours on that alone to understand it. But this material comes out just at the time that the trilateral meeting. And I believe there's a setup by this group, Mr. Carlucci, David Rockefeller, and Henry Kissinger and Alexander Haig, identical to the time when the tape was left on the door at the Watergate Hotel. Now, the San Francisco Chronicle had a very brief item the other day, Behind the Tower Report. Brent Scowcroft, this is General Scowcroft, the most obscure member of the Tower Commission, is fingered by insiders as the real force behind the scathing report on the White House blunders of the Iran-Contra affair. It was General Scowcroft, not retired Senator John Tower or one-time presidential candidate Secretary of State Edmund Muskie, who knew from his duty at the White House National Security as advisor where the skeletons might be buried. Now, Brent Scowcroft is on the board and chairman of Kissinger Associates. So just as the Scotch tape brought somebody up to the offices of the Democratic headquarters, Scowcroft could go immediately to the place where information was kept that would be putting this administration on the defensive for the next 100 years. Another article came out in the Washington Post February 28th. Computer detective found crucial data. Interns' high-tech sleuthing led to the files. And it tells about a 4-foot stack of internal NSC messages coaxed from a White House computer's memory bank by a 26-year-old staff member of the Tower Review Board, played a key role in the week's blockbuster report on secret dealings in the Iran-Contra affair. It was a real mother lode, they explained. The messages opened up that were discovered by Kenneth J. Krieg, K-R-E-I-G, opened up those stories that started the flow of information out about Ronald Reagan's affairs. The Washington Post said it was something only a young person could do. And you see, another article says that Scowcroft knew how to go there and what to go for. The young people like Oliver North and young technologists such as Mr. Krieg are blamed or praised, whichever you see it, for knowing where to find those hidden bodies or keys or doors that are open, in this case, computer technology. But on the other hand, Krieg had tips from General Scowcroft on where to go, and then everything else started tumbling down. All this computer technology baffles me, said John Tower. Other sources said Krieg, a 1985 graduate of Harvard University's John Kennedy School of Government, may have known what to demand because he previously had been assigned temporarily to the NSC's Crisis Management Center. Now, the Crisis Management Center was also joined by Fritz Kramer, who was on the board and part of the Crisis Management Center. He's also on the NSC, and his son Sven Kramer is on the NSC. So all you had to know is be part of the Crisis Management Center, and you know where to go for the inter-office profs, P-R-O-F-S. Those are the messages sent through the inter-offices. And I've watched the similarities between this and Watergate and who stays behind the scenes. And, of course, it's Kissinger and Haig who come out looking squeaky clean, and General Scowcroft could get this information. And as I say, the others then were forced to roll on it. They covered up a lot, but they got enough out to bring this administration down, but not enough to end the National Security Council. As John Tower and the others said, the National Security Council will stay as is. We'll just deal with individuals. They also said the Contra diversion is a black hole out there with some money in it, but John Tower knows where that money is. Now, Alexander Haig was on television the very week that the Contragate story broke of the connection of Iran to Nicaragua, the funds to Nicaragua. And he was interviewed night after night for about 5 evenings, announcing he would be president of the United States. The Miami Herald had a story March the 4th, Haig critiquing Ronald Reagan. Misjudgments spark the crisis. Polishing of his image is not enough, he says. Former Secretary of State Alexander Haig said Tuesday that the Iran-Contra crisis resulted from Reagan's misjudging of foreign policies and was not the single aberration characterized in the Tower report. He warned that in the effort to rehabilitate the Reagan image by seeking an arms control with the Soviets, America's long-term interests will be subverted. We can't use an issue of national security as a vehicle to get well politically, Haig said. He later said that he will announce publicly, which he's done already, that he wants to be the Republican nomination for president. Haig, in his first comment on the Iran-Contra crisis since the release last week of the Tower report, questioned whether White House staffs, including Senator Howard Baker as chief of staff, and the burnished image of the more engaged Ronald Reagan will be sufficient to stem the crisis. One thing is clear, all the talk about changing the president's image now from a hands-off to a hands-on president is just not going to do the job, Haig said. There's no longer a question of imagery. It is a problem of substance. And see, Haig knows that there's no substance there, so all you have to do is leak the tapes and computer disks that tell you where things went wrong. Things have gone wrong constantly, but these people stay on top, and now they're hammering or putting salt in the wound by tearing apart Rekovich, tearing apart the president, as Haig and Carlucci and Henry Kissinger travel around, participate in the trilateral meeting with David Rockefeller. It was after Watergate that Nelson Rockefeller became vice president, appointed by Jerry Ford. Nothing in the Constitution makes way for that. And now David Rockefeller, of course, is the titular head of the whole trilateral, and he's out there with Carlucci and Kissinger, and they're enjoying thoroughly the demise of the Ronald Reagan administration. Or maybe it's a Rockefeller vengeance for his brothers being deep-sixed in order for Ronald Reagan to become president. They let him be president, and now they're going a little farther. The article in the Miami paper says Haig viewed the Tower Commission's report from a unique perspective because as an Army officer in 1969, he was assigned to the National Security Staff as an aide to then National Security Advisor Henry Kissinger. Haig sat on the board. Haig was promoted to NSC chief under Richard Nixon, and in the final 2 years of the Nixon presidency, when a number of White House aides were being tainted by the Watergate scandal, Haig was brought in as chief of staff. He's ready for that job again, even though Mr. Baker is taking it temporarily. Haig this time wants to go for president. He's wanted for a long time. After an unsuccessful run for president in 1980, he was Secretary of State the first 18 months of the Reagan administration. So Alexander Haig is giving wire service interviews and news that your image isn't enough, that your arms control isn't going to work, you're weak, your staff is weak, and Henry Kissinger will talk 30 minutes about Rekovich, what he would have done, what the president did wrong at Rekovich, and what I, the great Henry, did, we should do again. And as the investigations go on in Washington, there's agreement between the House, the Senate, and the other offices that there will be moles between the Senate and the House, and that they will share information, that there'll be no surprises, and so forth. Jack Anderson had an article just this morning, Purge at the CIA, and it tells how when Ronald Reagan came in 1980, he had a secret hit list of 26 to be purged, and among what Jack Anderson calls the leftists is Frank Carlucci. Carlucci helped, just think of one term of leftists, he helped Vernon Walters, the Knight of Malta, CIA, DIA, to overthrow Brazil in 1964, and it took 22 years to get out from under the military dictatorship, and the night before the first democratically elected president is to take office, he gets sick, poisoned, goes through 4 or 5 surgeries that I did many broadcasts on, and dies. Mr. Tancredo Neves, and Mr. Sarney comes in after him. So if you think he's a liberal, Jack Anderson calls Carlucci a liberal, and he said that Carlucci left the CIA when Reagan came in, but he went to the Defense Department. He not only went to the Defense Department, but he picked along the way Eric von Marburg, the partner of Edwin Wilson and Frank Turple, and Theodore Shackley and Thomas Kleins, and the whole Contragate Iran team that had been in place for a long time, and worked his way back to become the chief of staff of the White House, of the National Security, rather, not the White House, and attends the Trilateral Commission with David Rockefeller, Henry Kissinger, And Haig, of course, trailing right with them, and Zbigniew Brzezinski is a part of the trilateral. Fritz Kramer is sitting on the National Security Council. I've done so many broadcasts on these people, but I want to repeat it until the vision of the power and the way the power stays in becomes really strong in your minds, and there's always new listeners to pick this up. I'll take a 1-minute break now, and then I just want to briefly discuss a book, The Agency, The Rise and Decline of the CIA, from Wild Bill Donovan to William Casey, and discuss that with you. It's published by John Ranelagh, Simon & Schuster. It just came out this past year, and it tells you the role of Kissinger and his team taking power from the CIA and putting it into the National Security Council. This is Mae Brussell, and it is part 2 of broadcast number 797. One thing that these manipulators don't take into account when they assassinate somebody like John Kennedy or Robert Kennedy, or Watergate a person like Richard Nixon, get him out of office with Spiro Agnew, or contragate a president like Ronald Reagan and George Bush as vice president. One of the things that they don't figure about and have to meet more opposition later in their actions are the amount of investigators that increase and do research and studies, so that it's more difficult to take control of power away from another group and not have raw nerves exposed. That is the trick, to do a surgical operation like a laser operation without cutting the body and showing the blood. But they don't yet have a laser operation for taking over power. So in the process of doing these grabs for power, even though they stay on top and look pretty good, it's pretty likely that someday they themselves will be thoroughly exposed for what they are and how they manipulated us, because in the process of their operations, as I say, more and more raw nerves come out, and writers, investigators, radio people are picking up these pieces and going with them. Now, this book, The Agency, The Rise and Decline of the CIA, is an interesting title, because the decline of the CIA is very evident in a case like Contragate, where William Casey is the director of the CIA, and he gives orders with the National Security Council and the Defense Intelligence Agency to not pay any attention to the CIA. We'll use them to shine our shoes. We'll tell them when we want to do something, but they're not included in the plannings. So that the taking of power, the decline of the CIA, began with William Donovan building it up, starting it, and then the decline with William Casey, who took away from his own agency. As a matter of fact, I have a very good long article from, I believe it's the Washington Post, that Ronald Reagan didn't use any of the agencies that he prided himself in building up. Now, this book from Simon & Schuster, interesting published, and I'll do more than that in a little bit, takes into account that when the CIA was formed, and until Richard Nixon came to power, it had a certain position. It got along with Congress fairly well. There was some congressional oversight by the mid-1970s. There was, after Watergate, there was oversight. But for the first 30 years, they existed well with Congress in an informal way, and the director of the Central Intelligence Agency and his associates seemed to not have too much conflict. John Kennedy fired the head of the CIA, Allen Dulles. He said, there's a secret government behind my back. But even when he had his head blown off, the CIA mingled with the congressional body, and there still wasn't any challenging of their activities. And Congress was at the same low level of the intelligence community in which they allowed these things to happen. That's why there isn't any conflict. But this book goes into the fact that before there was a Church Committee and investigation of the CIA, there was Henry Kissinger. And the author says from the day he entered the Nixon administration as National Security Advisor, Henry Kissinger asserted the dominance of the National Security Council. And see, that's the extra branch that wasn't provided for in the Constitution, or the German head who was running it, and its expanded staff over the Director of Central Intelligence Agency, the NSC, and the CIA in all intelligence matters. The administrative coup d'etat, and he refers to it as a coup d'etat when Kissinger came in, introduced a strong and devastating element of White House politics and prejudices in the intelligence process and often led to the CIA being excluded from any input into Kissinger-Nixon policy initiatives. With the creation of the Kissinger-Haig Plumbers Unit, the precedent was set for later national security involvement in covert operations that were formerly handled by more trained and experienced CIA personnel, closer to intelligence analysis and more distant from the Oval Office. The Carter and more recently exposed Reagan NSC dabbling in covert operations, particularly in Iran and Nicaragua, is the unfortunate offspring of the Nixon-Kissinger administration shift. And Mr. Ranley reports, in this quotation, very early in the Nixon administration, it became clear that the president wanted Henry Kissinger to run intelligence for him and not the CIA, and that the NSC staff in the White House under Kissinger would control the intelligence community. It was the beginning of the shift of power away from the CIA to the new center, to the growing NSC staff. It was a personal shift of power by the president in his own interest and an institutional shift as well. And the shift of power, of course, here is identical to Fritz Kramer working at the Kriegsacademy on shifting power to Adolf Hitler away from the existing German government and the agreements of the Versailles Treaty. The author goes on and says, from this point, the agency started to lose influence to the NSC staff under the president's special assistant for national security affairs, who in turn has paralleled and at times challenged the director of Central Intelligence Agency as being the president's chief intelligence officer. Of course, the CIA and the NSC were both formed in 1947. The Constitution had no provisions for them. But NSC shifted with Haig and Kissinger, currently enjoying their prominence, running for president, and one traveling with the CIA, not the CIA, the NSC director, Frank Carlucci, and David Rockefeller, and promoting their trilateral opinions. This book says the technique Kissinger used was never to say directly that he and the president wanted to ask for analysis generally, taking out of what was particular interest to them. This was matched by procedural and administrative changes that enhanced the position of the White House and Kissinger, particularly in intelligence matters. And of course, Fritz Kramer wasn't putting Henry Kissinger into a chalet or a home in Germany at Omer Ammergau with top Nazi officers, then putting him in Harvard and into the Council of Foreign Relations on the board of Chase Manhattan for nothing. Kissinger was trained and groomed for this job. And the author says in December 1968, during the transition period, this is after Robert Kennedy is killed a few months earlier and Martin Luther King, both killed in June. During this transition period before Nixon's inauguration, Henry Kissinger had informed the director of the Central Intelligence Agency, Richard Helms, that he was no longer to participate in full meetings of the National Security Council. Previously, the director of Central Intelligence Agency gave an intelligence overview briefing leading off every NSC meeting, and was an active participant in that body, which maintained responsibility for intelligence and covert operation requirements for the president, while Richard Helms, with the assistance of Defense Secretary Melvin Laird, managed to reverse the Kissinger dictate that he can't be present, and nevertheless was the beginning of the CIA's great slide into near ruin. And this goes into the NSC started building up its own agency, its own people, to destroy the CIA so that they could do what was referred to as back channeling. And he says that secret operations were never prohibited. Congress seemed to want to know about them, but that was a contradiction in terms. The excuse to not tell them was that there would be a leak, and in the Kissinger-Nixon back channeling, they were not informing officials. They were not informing them about negotiations or the details of policy, and the idea of secrecy and secret agency outside the congressional oversight was something that they created as soon as Richard Nixon came in power. And of course, I said that Richard Nixon was selected by the major aerospace industries, the Hughes Aerospace, the California group, the Lincoln Club, and a group of fascists after World War II. And he was meant to take over after Eisenhower died. He'd been vice president for 8 years and ran a Red Scare against Helen Douglas and Jerry Voorhees, and into Congress, the Senate and House against Alger Hiss. He was the selected president, and when he lost to John Kennedy in 1960, all that had to be arranged by people directly related to the Contragates today, and I'll be doing a lot of broadcasts on the links of the Contragate agents to the murder of John Kennedy. All they did was to get rid of John and Robert Kennedy and Martin Luther King, and their Nixon was back in power. Henry Kissinger was in power, and Alexander Haig was in power. Several years ago on World Watchers, it was 1984, 3 years ago, I mentioned this secret team is built up in Italy and the United States that controls the higher echelons of government and foreign affairs. Ted Rubenstein up in Palo Alto got an article from New Statesman titled "Wanted, Men Enjoying Power." It reported the Italian paramilitary commission investigating the P2 Masonic Lodge. Now, that was 3 years ago, but this is important because these people link directly to Donald Reagan, to the P2 connections, the pizza connections, and an indictment just went down this past week on 17 defendants. They were found guilty, but there are direct links of the Secretary of the Treasury, who became the Chief of Staff, to these very people. And what I mentioned 3 years ago was this article that talked about these higher echelons and how the P2 from Italy is connected to every major unsavory aspect of life in Italian Republic, of attempted coups, political assassinations, right-wing terrorism, left-wing terrorism, the mafia, not only in Italy, but in Latin America and in the United States. Their connections are there. One of the common denominators was Licio Gelli, the head of the P2, who attended Jimmy Carter's inauguration, Ronald Reagan's inauguration. And remember, this article referred to that inverse, that upturned pyramid, where at the top there's Licio Gelli and the mysterious world. And if you turned it upside down, there was the upturned pyramid where little is known. And Gelli is probably, this author said, a linchpin between the lower and upper pyramid. Well, what we're getting a view of now in the course of Contragate and the hundreds of articles that are pouring out is a view of both of these pyramids and where they touch and meet, and the operators, including members of the White House team, such as the White House Chief of Staff, his connections to the Vatican, to the Freemasons, to the narcotics traffic, and E.F. Hutton, managed by George Bush's brother-in-law. These characters melt right into these double triangles, one upside down to the other, and touch bases with a lot of raw nerves. Or if there's blocks in two pyramids, one upside down and one up touching, each of these little blocks that are carried by a lot of slaves who are then blinded are visible, and the pieces of these pyramids are coming out in all the various newspaper articles that are related to the Iran-Contragate story. One of the kingpins in this was Michele Sindona and his links to the American Mafia. And Sindona was closely tied into John Connally, Secretary of Navy, and to Permindex. And I want to make some of those connections as I go through the people that have been killed by these organizations. And I've talked about them for years. I want to update a lot of that for you, because what you're seeing now is not just a simple organization described as criminals, which this author Donald Sassoon refers to, is not just another mafia. It is the product of a political system which was constructed 40 years ago in 1944, at the end of the war, when this was written, by Italy's Christian Democratic Party. And of course, Alexander Haig is head of NATO and part of P2, and Henry Kissinger and Michael Ledeen melt right into the American-Italian team locking of a system of controlling the world, and use various organizations for that purpose. And in the process, a lot of people are expendable. They are used up and old, such as Ronald Reagan, and they can be kicked out, or Richard Nixon. Their power for all purposes is gone, but the framework stays on, and the framework are those people meeting the trilateral in San Francisco this past week. As I say, when you get this, the meeting will have been over, but for us, it's just happening. The newspaper this morning described a new assessment of Admiral Poindexter's work, that he played a central role in the NSC, that the congressional committees find him as a potentially important witness. He has a very keen memory. He keeps a lot of records. And they said the public interest is in the glamorous North, but the emphasis may be in the wrong place. Now, I never thought of Ollie North as glamorous. They built up all this stuff because they had ribbons and Purple Hearts from the war, and that was media hype. His secretary, Fawn Hall, It's media hype. North is media business. Every article is titled North did this, North did that, and then as time goes on, you find General Secord, a general in the Air Force, and Tom Kleins and Theodore Shackley, the CIA agents, and John Singlaub, a general. And then as time goes on, articles are pouring out now about their links to the Nugan Bank with admirals and generals, and CIA Director William Colby and intelligence lacings with the head of the Nugan Hand. It was run by Task Force 157, which was Henry Kissinger again, and Admiral Bobby Inman. And admirals are very important. John Connolly was Secretary of the Navy, John Lehman, Fred Korth, and the Navy Intelligence and the Defense Intelligence Agencies are the kingpins. So it's taken 4 months for the investigators that were hired and the powers that be to admit that there's something serious going on, and when you get Poindexter, you get an admiral. It's not a lieutenant colonel. I did promise some people I was with last weekend that I would pull out of my files, it was practically on the top burner, a couple of articles to update on AIDS before I get back or get too far into Contragate, because there's a lot of other things that get pushed aside, and the AIDS articles are important. One was sent to me by a listener of World Watchers from the Alameda County newspaper, the Daily Review, Wednesday, February the 17th. It's titled, "The United States is Storing Vaccines for Military." The United States military is stockpiling vaccines and drugs to be used to protect the armed forces, not civilians, during biological war. The military's research in the field, including search for an anti-AIDS drug, is unclassified, but their treatments do find non-military uses. Colonel David L. Huxell, commander of the U.S. Army Medical Research Institute of Infectious Diseases, said, "We just don't have budgets big enough to lay down a sizable stockpile of this material. The Institute has developed 16 vaccines and drugs against natural toxins or viruses. The Institute routinely tests the effectiveness of new drugs and a variety of these viruses at the National Institute of Health. The Institute last year began checking on drugs that against the virus that causes AIDS or acquired immune deficiency syndrome." So you could get immunized if you're in the military against certain viruses that in turn would trigger off AIDS. But if you're not in the military, we don't have enough to go around. When Ronald Reagan became president, he wanted a several $1 trillion weapons improvement. He wants $4 to $5 billion for 2 new ships. Each one is $4 to $5 billion. But they don't have enough money to immunize you for these viruses that in turn would start your AIDS. The article says the military stockpiles are intended for 3 million people, including all the armed forces, reservists, and the National Guard. The Institute at Fort Detrick in Frederick, Maryland, has about 500 workers. Its budget last year was $125 million. The faculty is charged with developing defenses against biological weapons. A treaty prohibits biological weapons but permits research for the defense. Now, if they already have a way to start AIDS, they can have the money now to find a way to defend those people against it, and they're focusing on defense against biological weapons. And researchers there do not use genetic engineering or other techniques to produce new virulent organisms. They're not doing that there anymore, even solely to, in turn, develop defense against them. We have enough diseases, they said. They're talking about altering an organism. I'm not going to second guess how somebody could alter that. There's enough bad ones out there, but what they're doing is creating a way to fight viruses, and those specific viruses cause AIDS, and the provision is to save 3 million people, and they will all be National Guard or military, so you better sign up. There was a story in the Wall Street Journal just this past week, March 17th. United States and French scientists seek to end the dispute over the discovery of AIDS. This is a bitter dispute that's been taking place between the National Institute of Health and the Pasteur Institute in Paris, each claiming that they discovered AIDS the same day practically. And Wall Street Journal describes it as a long, smoldering dispute. Who gets scientific credit and who gets the profit for making this AIDS immunization, if it's possible, once the AIDS is out. Dr. Gallo in the United States said his virus was HTLV-3. Dr. Montanier's virus is LAV. They're practically identical, and there was speculation in Paris about the royalties. Meantime, separately, the United States Patent Office granted Dr. Gallo from the National Institute of Health here in the United States, co-worker Milkolos Popovic, Popovic, they granted them a patent covering their method of mass-producing the virus for research purposes. The method was critical to AIDS research because it afforded scientists a sufficient quantity of virus to study. So the Americans can make as much virus as they want. They got a special grant, and in having it, they hope to kill off the target cells that disappear later, and it's unable to build up a resistance or a cure to AIDS. The whole idea is that these American scientists, and they've been working with the French scientists in Zaire, where there are a lot of AIDS, the Americans now have permission and a patent to mass produce the virus that's critical to AIDS and then to study it. But if they mass produce it, there's always a chance that it escapes or gets delivered somewhere, because can they keep control of everybody who handles the AIDS that they're going to mass produce? Another article, this is the Houston Post, February 15th, second AIDS virus strain found by researchers. Old blood tests that people were given can't detect the new bug. They can keep making a new virus now until kingdom come or till everybody is gone. This is out of Tokyo. A new strain of the virus that caused the killer disease AIDS has been found in some patients in Africa and Europe. At a conference in Japan, Dr. Francois Bar-Sinoussi of the Pasteur Institute said researchers must formulate a new blood test to detect a new strain. They had the LAV1, and now they have the LAV2. The new strain was enveloped in a different type of protein than the original virus called LAV-1 or HTLV-3. The human body forms a different type of antibody against LAV2, which makes detection by conventional tests more difficult. So now you have to go into new tests and new ways to detect AIDS, because the one test doesn't work for the new virus, and let's count how many viruses. Mortzall said the reason they started numbering World War I and World War II was that there would be other wars to follow, and they may as well give them a number. And sure enough, this year there are articles that they're making weapons for World War IV, and that World War III is a fait accompli. The Stanford Observer, this copy was sent to me by a listener of World Watchers, and I'm part of the Stanford alumni, so I get my paper also. They have an article, High-Tech Center for Genetic Medicine. Private sources, no government, commit $86.6 million. They're building a molecular and genetic medicine hospital run by Dr. Paul Berg, the Nobel Prize-winning biochemist, and it's going to study genetic medicine, and a big hunk of the money comes from the Hughes Medical Institute unit in molecular and genetic medicine. The Hughes Institute is giving Stanford $17.8 million. Now they say private sources commit this money, and $17 million comes from Hughes. Hughes was all military money. It was Hughes aircraft. It's all government. It's not private. These people make money from weapons, just as Hewlett-Packard fund Stanford. Each one gives like $40 million or $50 million this past year. They gave that. That's government money. One was former Deputy Secretary of Defense. It comes out of government contracts. How can you say it's private sources that are building this hospital for genetic medicine, molecular and genetic medicine? With that kind of money, with $86.6 million, and if you didn't have the right mind, you could really kill almost everybody on planet Earth, except the 3 million that will be immunized if they're in the military, and they've already said that's what they're going to do. And there was a long article in the San Jose Mercury, March the 8th, last Sunday, called Richard Secord, General Secord, led a secret counterterrorism unit. And I'm sure many of you have seen it. I'm sure it was, or I hope it was, syndicated in other newspapers, but when it just says San Jose Mercury, I'm not sure that you were getting it. And the important thing about General Secord, who comes out of Stanford Technology, which was TCI, and I refreshed you on it last week, and we'll talk about it quite often. TCI set up with President Otto von Bolschwing, Hitler's Gestapo, SS, and RCIA agent. Secord worked in the Air Force and met and worked with Oliver North and William Colby and Theodore Shackley and Thomas Kleins and General Singlaub. And then in 1983 he retired and went to work, according to this article, after he left the Air Force, he went to work as a member of the Defense Intelligence Agency. The Mercury says the idea for a special task force, and remember, North was supposed to set this all up alone. He just fell right into what was built. The idea for a task force developed with an informal discussion by administration officials in 1982-83. President Reagan approved the arrangement April 3, 1984, and signed a National Security Decision Directive directed by Oliver North. One essential part of the directive authorized the Defense Intelligence Agency, the Pentagon version of the CIA, to employ intelligence agents to collect information about terrorism. Unlike the CIA, the DIA is not required to report certain sensitive operations to Congress. And this is one of the things that I've hammered away, how these authors go around talking about the CIA, Philip Agee and John Stockwell and so forth, Ralph Magahee, and it is the DIA that took the power away from the CIA, just as I cited from this new book on the CIA, how national security took from the CIA. This story says, according to former associates, Secord, a fighter pilot and veteran air commando, led the anti-terrorist task force as one of a small group of government employees and consultants in Middle East, Southeast Asia, because he and those others were absolutely trustworthy, low-profile people who won't talk. Secord retired the year before in 1983 and was eager for a new counterterrorism assignment. According to Pentagon associates, a Secord loyalist who asked not to be identified. The Tower Commission report offers evidence to support the account, as do interviews with Secord's former Pentagon colleagues. The report revealed for the first time that Secord and North's boss, Admiral Poindexter, considered a commando raid in Lebanon. Now, the important thing is that when Secord left the Air Force in 1983, he became part of the Defense Intelligence Agency and was taken on by them in a non-salaried position, so it was on the books financially. But for all purposes, the other biographies of Secord said that when he left the Air Force, he joined Albert Hakim, which he did at Stanford Technology. So what Otto von Bolschwing and Emmanuel Seneca's and John Paul Getty's operation was, in setting this organization up, and the attorney was Simon Rifkin, who set the TCI up in the first place, the whole purpose was that these guys were a front, an operational front. They just didn't deliver weapons to the Shah or communication systems for the Defense Department. They took away from the National Security Council's regular operations and became part of the Defense Intelligence Agency. Now, the chief of the Defense Intelligence Agency for quite a few years was Daniel Graham, who shares offices with the mysterious Fritz Kramer. And so it's his agency that moves these people, and I knew it was all along. Theodore Shackley, Thomas Kleins, Albert Hakim, and General Singlaub. Singlaub was separate from TCI, but joins them in a lot of other operations and joins them through Western Goals and through Mr. Carl Spitz-Chamel's offices in Washington, D.C., and through the Reverend Moon operation. Singlaub joins them at that level. But this article is important because of the use of Secord as a non-salaried group. It says that the ISA was formed. This was an intelligence group that was formed earlier to free the hostages when Jimmy Carter was president in 1980, and that these people were part of the airlift that didn't work, the ill-fated airlift. But then after that, Secord and the others hired 13 of the 30 people, the crew, who helped defeat Jimmy Carter by having the airlift not work, and they've been part of the Iran-Contra-Gate operations. These are the same people, 13 of the 30. The ISA was supposedly deactivated in 1983. That is the intelligence agency that was set up in 1983, the same year that Secord retired. A year later, the New York Times said that the ISA was providing equipment and personnel to the CIA for covert operations in Central America. After his retirement, Secord remained in a high position to oversee covert activities. He served as a non-salaried member of the Pentagon's Special Operation Policy Advisory Group. So that is part of the Otto von Bolschwing network, where Secord is not salaried, not on the books, but works with Hakim out of Vienna, Virginia, and Los Gatos, California. And what was set up by von Bolschwing and Helena von Dahm and the Waffen-SS and the OSS is the operating organism or organization that the president has used. Our time is up now. I wanted to do, of course, a lot more in this hour, but the connection of non-salaried Pentagon people to Stanford Technology, given the background of that organization, is very important to understand how the president set up SOPOG, S-O-B-O-A-G, the Pentagon Special Operation Policy Advisory Group. It's very important to know that they worked with Noel Koch of the Defense Department and that the von Bolschwing network in California that worked with Edwin Wilson and Task Force 157, and I'll be doing more on that. The basis of all the things that we're seeing or realizing now go back to that research I did of TCI and Stanford Technology and the techniques of setting up pockets inside of pockets to the exclusion of Congress and existing agencies, which was the expertise of Henry Kissinger as soon as Richard Nixon became president. They had to have a few murders along the way, but when those were out of the way, Nixon was in, Haig and Kissinger were in, and Kramer could be on the National Security Council with his son managing events there behind the scenes. My time is up now, and of course I'll continue along these lines with a lot more next week. This is Mae Brussell. I'm behind in my mail. I'll write to you soon. There's too much news to answer letters, but I'll get to it. I promise. Eventually, I always do. Keep well. Thanks again for the articles and books, and I'll be back with you next week.